Good morning. I'm Harley Schleinger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for August 4th, 2025. Well, I have a very sober warning for people today. We're watching an escalation toward nuclear confrontation, and it raises the whole question that Dr. Pandor, the former South African foreign minister, brought up at a recent Schiller Institute conference. She asked the question, where are the adults in the room? How could you have this kind of almost spitting contest, only using nuclear weapons, as the consequence of a series of threats and actions, mostly coming from the West? Now, the problem we face is that with the escalation of tension, who's walking back from it? Who's going to address it? Now, what happened in the last couple of days is we saw Donald Trump issue a threat to Russia last Friday, talking about moving 2 Ohio-class nuclear submarines into position, into, quote, appropriate regions in response to a tweet from former Russian President Medvedev. And what Medvedev said is that the sanctions and the tariffs, and especially the threats of sanctions against Russian trade partners, is a threat and a step towards war. And this was spoken especially when the administration issued threats against India and Brazil, but also against Russia and China. And Trump responded by saying he's ordering the deployment of subs. And he warned of, quote, unintended consequences. Well, what are the unintended consequences? If you put forces on alert, if you put subs supposedly hidden undersea in positions where they can strike deadly blows quickly against an adversary, this brings you to the brink of war. And Scott Ritter perhaps was the most direct in his comments on it. He said, the Russian response so far has been calm, but they cannot rule out the possibility of preemptive decapitation strike against Russia. And in response, the Russians have something called the dead hand, which is an automatic response if they feel they're under threat. Now, in the meantime, what's part of the threat? The more weapons going to Ukraine, the Germans promising 2 new Patriot missile complexes to Ukraine, the possibility of the Taurus missiles for long-range strikes against Russia. And so you put this all together, and what you see is that we're heading down the road toward a confrontation. And who's going to stop it? Who's going to speak out to stop it? Now, the threats of sanctions and tariffs are not only against Russia's trading partners, but they're against the BRICS, by name. Trump said the BRICS members are anti-American and will have to pay a price for their anti-American policy, anti-dollar. Now, in fact, what the BRICS are saying is the financial system's in terrible shape. We need a new economic development architecture, which could include the United States. The Chinese have been explicit, saying they'd like the United States to be part of the move toward this new development architecture. And instead, the U.S., under Trump, Scott Bessent, and others, are saying, no, we have to dictate the terms. And at this point, you have the British, the French, the Germans, the so-called E3, on a head-over-heels drive for a military buildup, based on what they say is a threat of war with Russia within the next 5 years. So this is part of the escalation toward a total global confrontation. Then just add to that the provocations yesterday of the psychotic lunatic Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's a Greater Israel fanatic, leading a group of Jewish religious leaders to the Temple Mount to pray on the commemoration of the destruction of the 2 temples. And what Ben-Gvir intended was the same provocation that Ariel Sharon carried out back in 1987, which triggered the first Intifada. And the Israeli Defense Minister Katz said that this is an extension of Israeli sovereignty, in other words, sovereignty over the Temple Mount, which is a deliberate provocation. And so under these circumstances, you have a series of confrontations heading toward war. Now, one other aspect to show perhaps that Donald Trump is somewhat unhinged right now, and it's not clear why, but the fear in some Republican circles is that the economy is showing signs of significant weakness, especially in the bond market, the collapse of the dollar, the unwillingness of countries to accept the tariff policy. And as a result, the jobs report from last month was reconfigured, and it showed a loss of jobs. Now, that often happens, that they reconfigure it after the initial report. But this sent Trump through the ceiling, and he fired the economic statistician for the Department of Labor. In other words, fire the messenger when there's bad news. So under these circumstances, we see the world on a hair trigger toward nuclear war. Now, what's behind it? Well, it's clear. There's a British imperial drive to weaken and decapitate Russia. It's unmistakable. Listen to Malcolm Chalmers, the former deputy director of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, a leading British think tank. He's now the top advisor to the defense minister of Britain. And Chalmers said the United Kingdom should launch a tactical nuclear strike on a Russian military base as a demonstration of a strike from a nuclear sub. And no sooner did he say that than Trump moves subs into undisclosed but so-called appropriate locations. So this is why it's so important that the Russiagate investigation of Tulsi Gabbard move ahead quickly and identify who are the war hawks that are putting us on this course toward war. Now, we are putting out a white paper, the LaRouche organization, which will show that that Russiagate had nothing to do with Russian interference in U.S. election. In fact, the documents from the intelligence community showed that had low confidence in the evidence that there was Russian intervention. And now we have the Durham declassified annex, which said that before the summer of 2016, that is before the nomination of Trump, the Clinton campaign had prepared a report on Russian intervention, even though they said the evidence was not really there. And in fact, this was Debbie Wasserman Schultz, an exchange with Leonard Bernardo. Now, who is Leonard Bernardo? Senior Vice President of Soros Open Society Foundation. And in these emails, it shows they were making up the story, fabricating it. And involved in this was Andrew McCabe, the Deputy FBI Director. Later, as we know from other documents, Brennan and Clapper chimed in and overruled intelligence community experts who said there's low confidence that there's any Russian intervention, and said they have high confidence that the Russians are going to intervene. That's what Russiagate was about. It was about a long British war against Russia, the British Empire, and using such tools as CrowdStrike. Keep in mind, the head of CrowdStrike, which was a company doing cybersecurity for the Democratic National Committee, Sean Henry, the president, admitted to the Congress in closed hearings that CrowdStrike had no evidence of Russian exfiltration of files. In other words, the whole WikiLeaks story that the Russians hacked the computers as part of their operation was all made up. All of it was made up. It was a fairy tale designed to do what? To either make sure Trump didn't win the election in 2016, but after he won it, to make sure he could not proceed with his plan to normalize relations with Russia. And so now we see, while the evidence is coming out to show the absolute dirty operations that were run, the people who ran them are escalating toward the edge of nuclear war. And that's why we're going to be putting out this white paper on what is in the Gabbard files. It's important that it get around. It's important that people read it and think about it and recognize the danger and speak out. Those behind this in the United States, the Clappers, the Brennans, the Obamas, the FBI, the Comey, the McCabe, Peter Strzok, they all had an intention, which was to disrupt any potential normalization of U.S.-Russian relations. Instead of issuing threats, instead of moving submarines, instead of putting ballistic missile locations on alert, what should happen is a dialogue, a discussion. That's what Putin was asking for between 2014 and 2022. That's what the Ukrainians actually agreed to in April of 2022. And it was sabotaged. And who sabotaged it? Boris Johnson on behalf of NATO. Sabotaged the treaty negotiations. So we're getting the report out. We're crashing to get it done. As soon as it's available, it will be linked on the description section of this daily update. And while we're crashing, you should crash also. Think about who you can talk to. Download the material from the LaRouche Organization website and get involved in this mobilization. Keep in mind, 2 days from now, August 6th, will be the 80th anniversary of the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Are we prepared to live through a nuclear destruction of the planet based on lies and corruption? If not, get to work. Join us and let's make sure that we have some adults in the room before these decisions that are irrevocable